All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll just give a couple more moments here for participants to keep joining as the webinar just started. So bear with us for another minute or two, and then we'll go ahead and start the event. Thank you all for being here, and we hope you are looking forward to the event.
All right, everyone. Since it looks like we're about where we're going to be for the rest of the night, we'll get started. So I want to thank everyone for coming in tonight. This is covering the military, a conversation with military journalists. I'm Luis Aragon. I'm a senior here at Ripon College, and I'm studying sociology and anthropology, and I'm on the student advisory board for the Center of Politics and for the People. Once again, thank you everyone for coming. So today we're going to talk about the recent events such as the murder of private class Vanessa Guillen and the siege on the Capitol, and that has it's risen a lot of questions regarding the responsibilities of the military journalists and the role in military affairs. And to lead that conversation, we'll have Rhett Cunningham, but as well as our panelists here, Howard Altman. Howard is an award-winning editor and reporter who has previously been on the military reporter for the Tampa Bay Times. Before that, the Tampa Tribune, where he covered U.S. Central Command, U.S. Special Operation Command, and Special Operation Forces writ large, among many other topics. Next, we have Sarah Sicard. Sarah Sicard is the digital editor for the Military Times. She previously served as Army Times editor. Other work can be found on the National Defense Magazine, Task and Purpose, Defense News, Fast Company, Business Insider, and Adweek. And finally, we have Kyle Brentford. Kyle is a staff reporter for Military Times, focusing on the U.S. Army. He served an enlistment as an Air Force Specialist, Special Tactics, CCT, and JTAC. And with that introduction, we'll move on to Rhett, who will be the moderator for the rest of the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all again for being here. My name is Rhett Cunningham. I'm junior at Ripon, studying politics and government. And tonight I will be leading our discussion with our guests here. So before I pose the first question, I just want to give some context about why the board ourselves as students chose this event. And we as the board, we thought the topic was very important to highlight because of the recent events, especially the Capitol riot that occurred on January 6th. And we feel the event serves a greater purpose in understanding the methods in which U.S. residents are given information regarding civil military affairs. And this has become something that's really important in today's day and age. So I want to go ahead and get into the questions right away. And I want to start a little before the day, January 6th, and looking at the background of the event. So were there any indications an event like this might happen? Had there been any precedents for it? And perhaps what did the intelligence look like before that day?
Well, let me jump in here. There was clearly indications that something was going to happen at the Capitol January 6th. Remember that then President Donald Trump had sent out a tweet, come to DC, it's going to be wild. The FBI Director Chris Wray at a recent congressional hearing testified that the FBI had been gathering information about something happening. Didn't really say, what or what they did with the information. The previous Capitol Police Chief and the current acting Capitol Police Chief also testified. They testified they did not have information about what was going to happen. A lot of people, have criticized that because there were with the president's tweet, with statements that were made at that rally on January 6th, and the number of people that were moving towards the Capitol, there certainly were indications that something was going to happen.
Sure. So then based off of that, one of our pre-submitted questions was, why was there not more security at the Capitol on the day of the rally then, if intelligence did in fact indicate that something was going to happen?
All right, I'll take that question. Well, there were a number of issues involved. There were about 300 National Guard, DC National Guard troops who were in the Capitol that day, but they were helping to direct traffic. Because of the way the National Guard is set up in DC, it's not a state. It doesn't have a governor, so it has a different kind of chain of command. It has to, any request for National Guard in DC has to go up through the Army, and then ultimately the Defense Secretary, and then the President. So there was, concern that they didn't want to have sort of the bad optics of having, heavy National Guard presence. Remember that in June 1st, there was a situation where the President and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff and others had walked across Lafayette Square to go to a church. People pushed back. There was tear gas and a great deal of tumult that night. And so there was a concern about having a kind of a presence, those kind of optics. And so the decision was made not to ask for troops ahead of time. And now that's being reviewed, and whether a similar situation happens again is also being reviewed as well.
Sure. And then would you say that there's a precedence of these kinds of political decisions that have to be made interfering with military decisions, as it clearly did in this case?
Well, I mean, the military reports to the civilian authorities. This country is, civilian authorities. The president is the commander in chief, whoever that president is. And so that's how that chain of command works.
Sure. So then moving on to the actual day that occurred, January 6th, two of our panelists, both Kyle and Sarah, were there that day. So we want to kind of move towards what it was like covering that event and then the events of that day. So first off, just what was it like being there covering an event of that nature?
So when we got there, it was we what was it, around like noon, Kyle? We met up around the Washington Monument, where we could sort of hear like the rally that was going on. We didn't, we sort of went obviously to cover the National Guard, but as we were walking, we didn't really see that many. There was, 3 or 4 of them, Kyle, when we were walking around. So we were just sort of taking it in, kind of keep our distance. Obviously, there were a lot of non-mask wearers, which was kind of an interesting thing to navigate in this circumstance. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I made comment multiple times that it was fairly muted as far as the tenor, the temperament of everyone there. Obviously, we weren't, paying attention to like Telegram channels or any of those, chat channels that like the FBI was or should have been at least. But I didn't think prior to the event the crowd was like really out of control. And then it did seem to ramp up and spike up pretty quickly.
Sure, and maybe you could both kind of touch on some of the challenges of covering an event like this.
I think for me, one of the biggest things was not really knowing what was going on essentially outside the small bubble that we were covering. So I was with one of our other reporters, Phil Athey, and him and I couldn't get a signal when we hit the Capitol itself. So we didn't know if any of the tweets that we were publishing were actually going live. I couldn't get text messages. I couldn't check, my email, nothing was working. So it felt very sort of alienating to be basically in sort of the midst of everything. And we were getting, little tidbits of information just by, hearing things while we were passing by other people. And so that was kind of hectic on the ground for a while there.
I think one of the challenges, I was separate from them because I had actually planned on leaving. And then once stuff started happening over Twitter, I realized I probably should go back there. So I went back and, one of the things that I think is always kind of challenging, and whether it was covering the BLM protests over the summer or the riot at the Capitol, is, neither of these groups are as receptive always to media coverage. So sometimes just your presence there can be a little aggravating to some people. And, I think it's always challenging just figuring out the way that you're going to fit in and just, make clear that you're here doing a job documenting the event and that you're not, a participant in it and you're not taking sides and you're not, certainly not participating in the riot or anything like that.
Sure. And I think that's a good segue to the next question I wanted to ask, which was, this is obviously a very highly politicized event. So how does one maintain a sense of nonpartisanship when covering military affairs compared to, certain hosts on networks such as CNN, Fox, etc.?
Let me take that one. I mean, we're just journalists. We don't really, we're not columnists. We're not media personalities. We're not TV talking heads. I work with some really great journalists who seek out the facts, present them in the proper, with the proper facts and proper context. And that's really all we're interested in. We're not here for ratings. We're not here for to create trouble. Old adage I learned: does it shed light or does it just create heat? And we go for shedding light on that.
Sure. Yeah, so we want to start with the background, covering the event that day. So now, obviously, after the event, there has been lots of talk of the implications of it, especially with policy regarding the National Guard and just the role of the military and the government. So we have a couple pre-submitted questions here from our alumni that we'd like to touch upon. The first one being, is the all-volunteer military becoming too much of a separate culture and being disconnected with the people?
Yeah, so, thinking about this, it's kind of tough because I did serve in the military as a single contract enlisted person. And my personal experience just reflecting on that time was that, the people I met in the military, whether it was, I worked with Air Force and Army personnel in a deployed environment and domestically. And most of those people were the same kind of people that I went to high school with and that I would later go to college with. I didn't really find their demeanor or culture to be that different. I think one thing that is worth saying is that there is a culture that people kind of glom onto once they're in the service. And once you start taking into account people who are officers versus enlisted or career service members versus single contract enlisted people like myself who get out after 4 years, there's even more of a stratification with the culture that goes on there. So there's a lot of different subcultures within the military. I do think that to some extent, the veterans community is kind of self-policing. And I think a good example of this is in the post-surge years, after this surge in Iraq and Afghanistan, there have been kind of a lot of military clothing and lifestyle brands that have become very popular. If you don't really know what I'm talking about, you can Google like Vet Bro lifestyle brands, and I think you'll get a good idea of what I'm talking about. And those sorts of brands do highlight a lot of maybe unsavory elements of like military service. Maybe they glom too much onto the lingo, or they take too much pride in maybe like the veteran status. But what I've also noticed is that rather than those being like extremely popular among, veterans that I'm familiar with, I've noticed actually a little bit more of like a lashback against those, and maybe more of a view that those are kind of cringeworthy. So I think that there is some element of self-policing that goes on within the veteran community, maybe like all cultures and communities out there. And I think in the end, I don't think that the people who serve are really all that different culturally than the majority of Americans. That's my own personal kind of, opinion and anecdotal experience, and I'm open to other views on it though.
Sarah covers a lot of the social media end of Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting, like separate, I don't know if I want to call it a like a subculture too, is the like the military influencer world on social media, which, you know, there are some pretty extreme views on both sides coming from that perspective. So I think actually, if you go online, I think it's actually a lot easier to see sort of things that you don't see in everyday life or when you're talking to a person one-on-one, like face-to-face. So online, I think it's a lot easier to assume that there is a lot more extremism on either side. But I think it's because those tend to be the loudest people and they find their echo chamber, and their echo chamber basically takes whatever they say and, you know, blasts it out to everybody that follows them. And it creates this just wave of chaos almost. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I would probably agree with Kyle that for the most part, people do self-police. And that a lot of conversations actually, you know, like very like good, interesting conversations about military culture do come from some of these more extreme conversations that happen on the internet. So I'm kind of ambivalent about whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing that you see this kind of behavior online. But it's an ongoing sort of continuous thing that we're always monitoring.
Sure. So for an example, historically, in World War II, we trained the military about our government and democracy as part of their training. So one of our pre-submitted questions was, you know, is that something that could be done today? Is it feasible? And is it even needed in that case in this subculture of society?
As far as like civics classes, like participation in like government and democracy, there are, you know, the military has, you know, guidelines and regulations that govern how troops can act during, you know, election season. And I think they've done a fairly good job of updating that for like the 21st century with social media. When it comes to like civics classes in general, and just, you know, teaching good, how to be a good, you know, steward of democracy and participant in it, I think that that's something that should be the focus of like K through 12 education more so than anything, rather than relying on the military leaders to, you know, teach that to troops in like basic training or something like that. I think that should be a baseline thing for, you know, civilians, military, veterans, all people around.
Nobody does a really good job of that.
Sure. So then we also have quite a few questions that focus on the mission and the purpose of not only the United States Army as a whole, but of the National Guardsmen that were there that day and then that are still remaining there now. So the first one is just a broad question submitted by an alumni. What is the mission statement of the United States Army, and how does that fit into the current events that we've been seeing at the Capitol?
So, you know, paraphrasing here, but the general mission statement of the Army is to, you know, provide land forces for the U.S. military at large and participate as part of a joint force to take and hold, you know, ground, and then control that ground, whether it's like an urban area, you know, a strategically determined area, anything like that. How that really relates to the current use of guardsmen, I think, is kind of, you know, maybe a touchy subject. There are guards people still at the Capitol. I believe they've been extended recently. Howard, step in if you.
Yeah, but through middle May.
Okay, so they are still there. My understanding is they're just doing the same sort of security work they've been doing before. I don't think that that mission statement is totally applicable to their current role. And I think what you're seeing them do is just the sort of, you know, activating for civil unrest that the Guard has historically done for, you know, decades upon decades. I don't think it's really anything super outside the norm, except for the fact that the location and the events that preceded it were, you know, had a significant gravitas to them.
Sure. So would you say then that the current deployment of National Guard units to the DC is or is not a major change to that mission?
It might be a major change for the troops that are there, but historically the Guard has done this since the Whiskey Rebellion back in the day. At least 16 times throughout the nation's history, we've seen the National Guard deployed in these kinds of situations, 9 times for riot control. Often happened during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s as cities burned, as after the death of the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. after, there's certain events that took place in the country. So this is within the mission set of the Guard. They're pretty overextended these days. They're in the past year, tens of thousands of Guard troops have been deployed from everything from COVID-19 response to civil unrest to natural disaster, as well as their rotations to overseas. And now we have the hurricane season fast upon us in June, so there's no rest. And it's getting to the point where a number of Guard leaders have asked their states to increase the number of troops because there's been so many missions, and the National Guard is becoming fast the hammer for every nail, and whether that's sustainable is questionable.
Sure. So then for the training for these kinds of missions, if this is kind of a shift from that, do you think National Guardsmen should receive training for civil unrest? If so, what kinds of MOSs or jobs does that pertain to? Is it just combat arms? Perhaps it's expanded to all members of the National Guard for each state. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So they do receive training. They receive, civil unrest, riot, and crowd control type training. You can go online and find videos of this that the Guard units themselves have released, and they predate obviously the events that have happened here. It's something they receive regularly, and it's not just when they get activated. And it involves simulated protesters throwing water at them, jeering at them, just things like that to kind of simulate what it would be like for them to be in a riot or facing like an angry crowd. So that is kind of like the training that they have, historically gotten. And I think that my time covering it this summer and, even being out there on the evening of January 6th and seeing the Guard respond, I thought that they actually, acted, pretty well. Well within the bounds of what they were supposed to do. Obviously, there's been some criticism of the Guard in the wake of the January 6th riot. But I think most of that criticism and the room for growth really does go to the chain of command and the processes by which they're used rather than the individual actions of Guard personnel.
Sure. So then more broadly about the National Guard and then just the use of military force in civil unrest, maybe you could touch upon the Posse Comitatus Act and its impact on the use of military force domestically in the United States.
Yeah, so Posse Comitatus was originally enacted in order to prevent the U.S. military from interfering in elections after the Civil War. More to the point, that was just for the Army, but since we've added several services, it now extends through the full range of the DoD. But what that really means is that basically the United States Armed Forces are not to be used as a police force for enforcing the local legislature laws. So there is obviously an exception to that, which is the Insurrection Act, which says that either the federal government in the form of the president being commander in chief or state legislature in the form of the governor of whatever state can call up the National Guard to help out with civil unrest, but that's extremely different from the use of Posse Comitatus, because you're not actually using them to enforce the law per se. You're using them to prevent violence. So it's kind of it's a little bit of a gray area, but the cases have been pretty clear. And in this case, this is a very clear Title 32, where the federal government is DC is not a state, so it's a little bit more complicated. When the National Guard is basically protecting DC because we don't have a governor, but for all intents and purposes, they're acting under Title 32 now.
Sure. So all those questions focused on the mission and the criticisms of the Guard themselves being there on that day. And since then, so I want to touch upon briefly after that, and more so the political implications and how members of our government have kind of dealt with the situation, whether if it's the extensions or them actually being at the Capitol. So one of the things that has been in the news a lot is the treatment of the servicemen while they've been serving there, whether it be recently problems with food service, members falling ill, There's also been instances of members of Congress kind of using their interactions with the National Guard as kind of a politicized event for themselves. So maybe one of you could touch upon that kind of political connection between the military and the United States government.
You wrote about the food, right?
Yeah. The food issue, I think anytime service members deploy anywhere or even just go to training, food issues are always going to be like one of the central complaints of service members, just the kind of chow they're getting, how they're sleeping. So those aren't really outside the norm, I think. It was a little different, I think, seeing, troops sleeping in the Capitol, or maybe them being in the Capitol and getting poorly delivered food. But I think that just breaks down to issues with the contracting. And I think that's kind of extraneous to the larger political situation going on. As far as troops being used as a political football, I think when you have an institution like the U.S. military, which is typically kind of revered in the United States and seen as nonpartisan, it's very tempting for politicians to utilize it in some way, and maybe sometimes also just not totally being aware that they are using it in a way that may be politicizing it. A lot of people like to pander to the military because the military, again, is just, it's one of the few things in the U.S. that I think is still tends to be approved of by the population, at higher rates than Congress itself, right?
I mean, you recently saw where troops from Guam, led by their lawmakers, had visited the office of Congresswoman Green, who had questioned where people from Guam, part of the U.S. That raised a lot of hackles because you had people in uniform showing up at a congresswoman's office. National Guard said there wasn't a political statement. A lot of people thought that that was an inappropriate use of troops as a stunt, as a prop. And that goes to what Kyle was talking about, that troops are unwitting pawns often in these political games played by civilian leaders. And also some talking heads. We talked about talking heads, the whole issue of Tucker Carlson and his comments. And that created a whole firestorm of controversy as well.
Sure. So specifically for members of the government, then there's obviously it's a minority of members of our government who are veterans. Do you think that that places a greater responsibility on them in regards to these affairs, or even that maybe veterans and people's service should be kind of prioritized in terms of being elected to a federal or even a state position?
I mean, I would say that it should be, I don't know if this is exactly your question, but I think that it should be, if you're an elected politician, you should try to separate yourself from, your veteran status as much as possible. I really don't think that that should play a part in how you're politicking. And I don't think that that should be, something you're constantly bringing up. Again, that kind of goes into my own personal opinion on it, but I think it's also, something that would help, prevent the military from being perceived by the general population as something that, is closely associated with one party over the other.
Sure. So we have one live question submitted in the Q&A that focuses more on some journalism specific questions, and we actually have some pre-submitted and prepared questions as well. So I think we'll shift a little more towards, military journalism itself and the responsibilities. So first, just broadly, we have a question for one of our alumni. How has covering the United States military and related issues changed over the course of your respected careers?
I'll start off with that, since I've been around for the longest time, being the oldest guy here. It's changed, a bunch over the years. One of the biggest things is that as we've drawn down troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, there are fewer opportunities to embed with troops. There's almost no opportunities now. which is really a great loss because, especially for a lifelong civilian like myself, what you learn being embedded with troops is really important. And if you're going to cover this, it really helps. So that's a real loss to not be able to get out there. There have been ebbs and flows in terms of the openness of flows of information. When General Mattis took over as Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump, President Trump, the flow of information often stopped. I mean, Mattis really shut things down. There were no briefings in the press briefing room at the Pentagon. Trying to get questions answered was much more difficult. And that's since reopened to the point where Press Secretary John Kirby holds press gaggles and press conferences 3 times a week, maybe more. So that's, kind of, improved over the years. But the big change is we don't get out to combat zones as much as in the past.
I think for me, because I've never been able to embed, one of the biggest things that I've really noticed is sort of the growth of social media has made our jobs more interesting. And I say that meaning when I first started, I had a really easy time using social media to gain sources. But I think maybe in some ways this goes to the politicization of the military a little bit, or the fact that a lot of people view journalists as having political bias. But that's actually made it kind of difficult to sort of source like within units, just like individuals that I want to talk to about a story, because they're really reluctant to talk to people that they don't necessarily trust based on the sort of impression that they have of the media right now. So that for me has been sort of a growing concern, because I used to just be able to reach out to people on Facebook and source a story in a day. Now, if I want to, find somebody on a very small unit level, I have to go and be very careful about how I do it. And I think that that's sort of been an interesting development for me in my career.
Yeah, nothing has, I started covering the military at the beginning of the Trump administration, and, nothing really changed all that much over the past 4 years for me. But I will say for them, I think that the points that my colleagues made were really good. So I'll just skip right over to the point about, what the most difficult part of it is. And for me, it really is prying information from the Department of the Army. I don't really have to worry too much about, whether the Secretary of Defense is going to host a press conference or anything like that. But one thing that I do have trouble with is just consistently getting, whether it's a data set or an investigation or a report or even just an update on something that happened. The military is very, for, probably a myriad of reasons, reluctant to speak and divulge anything. And you really do have to fight tooth and nail for any little bit of information. It's a very opaque institution. And, with the exception of maybe the intelligence communities, I think it's probably the hardest, government agency to actually peel information from.
I want to add something. One of the advantages they've had over the years was being able to be a reporter in garrison. I was in Tampa, which is home to U.S. Special Operations Command, U.S. Central Command, 2 Air Force wings. So, I got to hang out with people. The people I went drinking with were, Green Berets, SEALs, JTACs, all kinds of people that, had a lot of information and insight that I could call upon to just, hey, what's going on? By being a community, DC is very different. You don't have as much of that, and so I think that's a challenge as well. We talk about reaching out to real people.
And COVID's made it worse.
COVID's made it much worse, absolutely.
Certainly. Yeah, so Kyle, you touched upon it there at the end too. The follow-up question to the changes over the course of your careers was, what are the biggest challenges today? So you had already touched upon it, but either Sarah or Howard, if you have any comments on that.
I'm sorry, which?
The biggest challenges of military journalism today.
I have to concur with Kyle. Is it is a very opaque organization that there are some public affairs officials who understand what we do, and help. Others, think that they're protecting the institution by preventing information from coming out, and that's not really, helping anybody. I mean, our job is to help the American public understand why their children, their relatives are being put in harm's way, why their taxpayers' dollars are being spent on this. And when you don't tell your story, it gets told for you. So we kind of have to try to convince me. It's not always a happy story. Bad things happen. It's a big organization. People are putting their lives on the line. People sometimes don't come home, or when they do come home, they're damaged. So there's a lot of unhappy things. There's a lot of great stories, and one of the reasons why I love covering the military is just some incredibly inspiring stories over the years. We're going to know a lot of people who've overcome some amazing challenges. Friends of mine have lost 3 limbs, who win numerous gold medals at the Warrior Games. So that I find is one of the most inspiring things. But it's as Kyle said, it's a constant battle to get information.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably only add that, like, as somebody who didn't serve in the military, it can be an intimidating sort of beat to follow. When I was 22 and starting out, learning every acronym in the book and the lingo and everything that goes with covering the military, in addition to sort of understanding the culture as well, because the culture is quite different than covering, say, I mean, I went to school in New York, so fashion, a lot of people did fashion or business. And I found that to be very intimidating. And even to this day, sometimes I'm just constantly like sending emails to people being like, am I saying this correctly? Am I doing this correctly? Because it's the authenticity is an absolutely necessary part of covering this beat too. So I think that that's kind of an interesting challenge.
Sure.
I give big props to my colleagues here. When I was starting out, I was covering the sewer committee, so it's quite different.
Definitely. So Howard, you had briefly mentioned embedded journalism, and so maybe you could speak to the challenges of being an embedded journalist specifically.
I mean, a lot of it depends on where you go, who you go with, who your public affairs minder is. I did an embed with the 7th Special Forces Group in Afghanistan a number of years ago, and get out there. And well, first of all, the airlines lost all my luggage, so I had none of my clothes, none of my body armor, helmet, nothing. So that made a great impression on people right away. But when I got to Kandahar and met up with my minder, she was trying to tell me that she'd have to read all my stories and look at all my pictures before I send them. And she wasn't a public affairs, she was a combat camerawoman. I had to explain to her that is not really how it works. I'm 8,000 miles away. I'm stuck out here. I'm depending in many ways on you, but this is not really how it works. And I suggested very strongly, I told her, go talk to your chain of command, because it's not the way it works. And she did, and it really wound up working well. So that's one challenge. It's access. It's also in some ways what your bosses want. I mean, my bosses wanted me to constantly churn out copies, so I wound up in my hooch, a lot of times writing stories when I could have been out, spending time with the commandos. But it was a great embed. Challenges are equipment, time, how much time you have with people, how much, I've been on trips where it's like boom, boom, boom. They don't want you to have any like downtime. That's kind of it. You need some time to think and react. Unfortunately, like I said, that's not really happening anymore. I don't know that anybody in our office has embedded since I've been here in the last 2 years. I don't believe so. And that's, again, it's a real loss, especially for civilians who have never served, that to live with folks and see how they, what makes them tick. What do they talk about when they're sitting by the fire pit and shooting the shit, and what do they think about? What do they care about? What kind of music do they listen to? How do they react when something happens when you're outside the wire? All that stuff is it's a loss for the American public, I believe.
Sure. So moving more towards now the overall role of military journalists. So the story of Private First Class Vanessa Guillen was a highly covered event in the military community. So I wanted to ask, what is the responsibility of military journalists for bringing up systemic issues within units in command to light? And is it something that's a duty, or is it more of a whistleblower or expose role that should only be used in drastic situations? We've seen this especially, she was a specific case, but with Fort Hood in Texas.
What is the role of the journalist in that, or of the service member?
So yeah, the journalist. So what's the responsibility of journalists in those cases? Is it a duty to kind of play that role, or is it more something that should only be limited in terms of exposing those kinds of situations? Is that something that should happen internally, or is it the journalist's responsibility?
I mean, I think it's the journalist's responsibility. Like Vanessa Guillen was, murdered. So that definitely falls within the journalist's purview to report on any sort of like homicides that are going on, especially if they're going on base. In her case, it was in an armory. There's a lot of, background to her story. There's allegations of sexual harassment. So it ties into a lot of different issues that are really significant in the military right now and kind of cross service. I think that her case, as tragic as it was, one of the responsibilities of covering it as a journalist is also opening up the aperture and looking beyond it. There were other individuals at that installation who were murdered previously, some whose cases went unsolved for long periods of time. And, as the ongoing coverage of that case has, continued to roll out, there's more and more issues that kind of have been spotlighted. And I think that, one is with CID itself, the Army's Criminal Investigative Division, and the different myriad of issues that CID detachment at Fort Hood was dealing with. And so as a journalist, it's also your responsibility to not, if you're at the national level, basically covering it from DC, to try to see if it is a national issue and not just focus at this one installation. And so I think as a journalist, just constantly kind of looking for, I guess patterns and just, trying to see what the larger implications of a case like that is. And there certainly have been a lot of implications with that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of piggyback off that a little bit. I think we've gotten to a point where there's a lot of advocacy journalism from certain publications. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's what we do, and you guys can disagree with me. But I think that just by reporting truths and facts that you find, you can sort of play a role in sort of advocating for things to get better. And so instead of inserting yourself into that story and, talking about why this needs to change, you're really just sort of being a vehicle for the conversation. So I think that that's sort of the role that we have.
I mean, what we try to do is gather facts, gather documentation, proof, evidence, and put that all into a story that, again, is accurate, not just in the facts, but in the context, so that we're not taking anything out of context, not blowing it out of proportion, not spinning it, presenting the facts as they are. And journalism plays an important role, not just in the military. I've been doing this for a long time, and when you shine the light on situations, sometimes it's the only way that they can change. When you highlight some wrongdoing, you highlight some malfeasance, misfeasance, or any other kind of feasance, you can help engender change. But again, it has to be done with facts, documents. These guys are very good reporters, and when they bring us a story, it's solid.
Okay, yeah. And I'd actually like to ask some of our viewer submitted questions now in the live Q&A that's still focused around the roles of journalism and journalist specific questions. So the first one is, how do you offer a well-rounded story for your readers while balancing potential issues with security issues?
Well, I mean, we are keen enough, we know enough about tactics, techniques, and procedures, and are, concerned enough about not putting people's lives at risk. We balance this every day. I remember doing one story when I had some information about a hostage rescue that gone wrong in Afghanistan. It was still sort of an active situation. The folks from CENTCOM asked me to sort of hold off because it would have put people's lives at risk. And this is where you build this trust relationship with your sources. I trusted them enough to know that if they came to me and asked me to hold off on the information until a certain point, they did. And we wound up, when it was safe, and we published a story at that time. And sometimes you don't. It's really a balancing act.
Sure. I don't know if they're.
Yeah, I mean, I recently, just like a few weeks ago, broke a story about a CID agent who had allegedly used a poison to kill his wife. And he had been under investigation for several months, and I had learned about the investigation, and I came to CID officials and approached them about it. And I agreed to hold the story pending the arrest until he was in custody, because they had concerns about, obviously, if a story came out and the guy realized he was under investigation, him fleeing or doing something else. And so we do make those decisions in-house and on advisement, of course, from people that we are talking to about it. Thankfully, most of the stories, in times where I think stories where the military would rather me hold off on publishing it, it's usually events that have already passed. So
it's a tricky one. It's a live event. We're not going to, if somebody's embarrassed by something, if it's a fact, it's a fact. That's, it's unfortunate, but we didn't cause that problem. We're just reporting about it.
And then another live question that was asked was, given that you are working for publications that are under a wing of the government, are you able to write without biases that stem from a given administration?
We're independent of military, so we can pretty much write, whatever.
Okay. Well, similarly, then you, Kyle and Howard, you both touched upon this, but are there any certain limitations or influences you feel from within the government? Sure, you're independent, but maybe I would also extend that to what you kind of just talked about within the military as well.
I'm not sure what you mean. Like, do we get pushback or blowback, or if we do something? I mean, we balance this all the time. There's people who get upset. We had a situation where we had an interview with the previous Secretary of Defense, and they weren't happy with us running it. They cut us out of certain things, and that's just the way it is. There's a business that often relies on access, but you also have to know that the story is bigger than the access. You have to weigh that. Sometimes, public affairs officials can be somewhat punitive. We've seen that in the past. We've also seen people that stand up and get it and help us get the information too.
I mean, I would just say that, I've written a lot of stories, especially lately, about CID. I think that this CID and, the military police corps haven't been super fond of, but they've all been accurate. They have far more PAOs than we have reporters, and I'm sure they comb through every story I've written, but they are all accurate and they're all factual. And so we do mind our P's and Q's in that way. The other thing I would say is, as far as like being worried about like influence, because, they'll throw me off the roster for a media briefing in the future. To be honest, I don't think we really worry about that. I know I certainly don't, because the good stories that I do get tend not to come from the official channels anyway. And so, it's, if they wanted to play that game, and, I would say also that for the most part, I don't really experience the lashback where I'm being nixed from media briefings because I wrote a story that's not favorable to them. I may, get like a phone call where we chat about something they think that I painted something in, a light that they don't really agree with, but, I haven't really experienced any sort of retribution or anything like that.
We've got other reporters that have, and Kyle does such a good job on that story. He's earned the respect of, people across the military as a result. And that, when you do it right like that, that respect is worth more than anything. That's the gold standard what we do.
Sure. So then more broadly then, working for a private military publication, do you see the role of a military publication as being any different than a traditional mainstream media outlet, especially when covering issues such as the Capitol riot?
Let me tell you, the first since I've worked at newspapers, weeklies, dailies, I've done TV, radio. No, I mean, we're basically a news organization. Our reporters are skilled in journalism and they perform the function of journalists, just like somebody covering City Hall, somebody covering the Sewer Commission, which I once did, or really anything else. So no, there's really no difference.
I'd actually add, I was talking to one of my old journalism professors about this because he asked if I was interested in joining the mainstream media. And my answer at this point is honestly not really. One of the things that I have noticed covering this beat basically for the last 7 years has been that people in niche media tend to know the subject matter a lot more. They become experts in it. If I sit on a round table where there's a CNN reporter or anyone else who's mainstream, they tend to ask very broad questions because they have a broad audience that they're trying to reach for. So if you're looking for news that is very specific or has a lot more context about the very specific topic that you're looking for, and this goes for not just military media, but it could be anything else. If you're talking about energy, the environment, whatever, those niche publications with reporters who've been covering this stuff for years tend to actually have better insight, I think. So it's kind of an interesting thing to sort of balance there.
Sure. So actually, Sarah, we just had an attendee ask a question specific for studying journalism. So they asked, what advice can you give to someone who wants to study journalism and how they can get involved with covering the military?
I don't know if I'm the best person to ask that because I didn't intend to end up in this space. I sort of stumbled into an internship and it seemed like a good opportunity because I grew up in a very, very military area and my dad was in the Navy for his entire career. So it just kind of worked out. I think that if you are interested, niche media is a really great way to go find an internship at one of these trade publications or something like that, because it'll give you so much insight into the type of information, and it'll familiarize you with the lingo, it'll familiarize you with all the people in the space, and you can really build your portfolio that way. And the editors at those sort of niche publications tend to be really, really hands-on with the with newcomers, whether it's an internship or like a fellowship or whatever.
Sure. So we have two more live questions that were just submitted, and they both go back to the embedded topic. So Howard, I'll cater these to you. The first one is, you've kind of already touched upon, but how hard is it for journalists to embed and cover stories in foreign countries? And you had mentioned that those opportunities have kind of decreased. So why have they decreased then in recent years?
I mentioned before that with fewer troops, there are fewer opportunities. There's a certain infrastructure that takes place when you are, as journalists with troops, you've got to have somebody that's going to be with you. There's transportation issues. It's not like you can just hop a bus from Kabul, Kandahar, or the P-15 from Herat. So there's a lot of built-in infrastructure issues, and they're not happening. Now, other ways to do it are I've had opportunities to just say go to Syria and link up with folks there. For whatever reason, my organizations didn't want to fund that. I had a chance to hang out in Ukraine with some Ukraine Special Operations Forces. That was an issue of our company making a decision not to go. Some opportunities exist. You got to be creative. I took every opportunity. I wanted to spend some time flying around with KC-135 Stratotanker crew. So we flew over Iraq on a combat mission, spent some time in Al Udeid and Qatar, took trips with the head of U.S. Central Command around the region. So, I looked for every opportunity I could to be able to get out there, because it is really, it's great to see other places and experience things like that. So if you're creative and if you have an organization that's able and willing to do that, you still can find ways. It's been a tough time for news organizations, with the economy and COVID. So that's also added a great layer of challenge. But we just had one of our reporters, our Pentagon reporter, just took a trip with the Defense Secretary. So that, hopefully we'll be doing more stuff like that.
Sure. And then for the last embedded journalist question, one of our viewers asked if you could identify one place that really should be covered through an embedded journalist that isn't currently being covered.
That's a good question. There's a lot of places. We still have troops in harm's way in Afghanistan and Syria. I'd like to go to Syria, spend time with troops there. Things are, a little bit hot sometimes in Africa. I'm sure that my colleagues have places that they like to go to. Where would you like to go, Cal? Where would you like to go, Sarah?
I think Mozambique would be really interesting. There's been an interesting Amnesty International report about a South African mercenary group committing, alleged war crimes there, and then a U.S. Special Forces team just, got embedded there in order to start training Mozambique forces. So there's obviously something bubbling up there, and that's something that I've read 2 articles about, and it's kind of information scarce. So, there's a lot of things going on in the world that I think are very interesting.
Where would you like to go, Sarah?
I'm fascinated by all the proxy wars going on in Africa. So I think that pretty much anywhere in Africa would be pretty cool to sort of, just get feet on the ground and really see what's going on. I also, would find it very interesting to be somewhere like, I don't know, Iran.
Sure. So we have one last viewer submitted question, and this will be our final question for the night. And I'll ask it to all 3 of you. It's kind of already been touched upon in the past, but this gives you all three of you the chance to answer it. So the question is it difficult to maintain your objectivity and keep your emotions in check in your job?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I think, I've also worked in politics, so I have my opinions. I try very hard not to voice them or let them seep into my my coverage ever. I think there is a really interesting, sort of dissection of people who think that it's perfectly okay to put your opinion in your journalism, and there are plenty of publications that back that. We obviously don't work for one, but I think there's a misconception that journalists don't have opinions or shouldn't have opinions. You should have them. You just shouldn't let them influence the way that you cover your stories.
And Kyle, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, you have overt opinions, and you have sort of your subconscious opinions and the presuppositions that, you write an article based on, and you can't really combat the, things that you tacitly believe. And there's a lot of things that, we as Americans generally, tacitly believe. But, I think that the best thing that can be done is actually on the reader's end to read a wide swath of different news coverage, foreign and domestic, and, read the wire services like the AFP, read opinion journals in the US, and read opinion journals from the UK or from Europe, or, especially if you read South China Morning Post, just read widely. And I think that's the only way you can really, get around those subconscious opinions that we all have.
I'd say challenge your assumptions. I've been both, a straight journalist, and I've been an opinion columnist. The opinion columnist is rather fun because you can just spout off, and but based on facts. But my tongue is extremely callous these days because I don't add opinion to fight internal bias. As Kyle said. We all come from a point of view, no matter who you are. You have preconceived notions, and I think you need to sort of battle those. In terms of, there's a question about emotions. Over the years, I've seen some pretty horrible things in the business, and sometimes they do affect you. I remember one time there was a situation where we were reading the report on a 9-year-old girl who got buried alive, and that was just awful. It was awful for the reporter who's looking at it, awful for everybody, and kind of have to check up on each other afterwards sometimes when that happens. But again, we're at the end of the day, we are serving a job. We are here to inform the public in our space about what's going on in the military. And if we don't do that in a way that maintains trust is very hard to maintain, to get, and it's very easy to lose. And if we don't do our job in the right way, then we're not going to be able to do it. So that is our mission. That's what we try to do every day, to present information without bias.
Certainly. Well, that is all we have for all of our questions, both pre-submitted and live. So thank you all for engaging with me and answering your questions. I'm going to go ahead and pass on to Luis so we can give our closing remarks. So thank you to all of our guests, and thank you to everyone that viewed our event tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. And here is Luis.
So I just want to echo the statements by Rhett. Thank you to our panelists for coming. It was a pleasure learning more about military journalism, and thank you for our audience members for submitting their questions. So we do want to announce our next Center for the Politics and the People event, which will be taking place Wednesday, the 31st of March, which is just 2 weeks away. It's going to be entitled Brain Politics. And to give you a little description for it, it's the brain underlies our beliefs, our personalities, our fears, our hopes, and our political stances. In this talk, neuroscientist and New York Times bestselling author David Eagleman will marshal data from cutting-edge neuroscience that reflects on who we are, how we decide, and why we hold the beliefs we do, and why our brain loves to build in-groups and out-groups. That being said, we'd love for you guys to come and join us for that event. Again, Wednesday, March 31st at 6:30 p.m. And then finally, just as a reminder, this session was recorded, so it will be posted on our YouTube channel in the next coming days. And we'd love if you guys would follow us on our Facebook page at Ripon College Center for the Politics and the People to stay up to date on any future events for the rest of the year. So once again, thank you for our panelists for coming, and thank you for our audience members, and thank you to Rhett for moderating this discussion.
Thanks for having us. Great.
Right.
Great.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everyone. Have a good night to all of our participants and our guests, and have a good night.
Don't forget to read us at militarytimes.com.